thank you very much, and I appreciated the tour of the island this morning, and you've got great potential. I also want to say before I begin, I read these reports, and they are two of the best reports I've seen from agrologists ever, because they cover the wide spread of just about everything you could think of that to resolve this problem. So many of them just have a narrow perspective, but they're very, very well done.
Hey, Julie.
Okay, what I'm going to do is, and I can talk long, I can talk short. I've got a lot of pictures here, but I won't necessarily deal with all of them. But I'm going to tell you a bit of the history of the Agricultural Land Reserve, and then I'm going to move into a little bit about parks and farmland and some of the things we can, solutions to some of the problems you've got here. Starting with it though, I want to show what it looked like before the Europeans first came. Unfortunately it doesn't show Bowen, but you can see all the little black numbers on there. These were First Nations villages, First Nations campsites, hunting and fishing sites. This was Eden to the First Nations people. Unbelievable amounts of fish in all those streams, even going out into Vancouver. Unbelievable amounts of clams and oysters further out in the islands, and deer and cranberry bogs. It was paradise. And they built villages on some of the islands and big houses, and they had lots of time for arts and cultures because the food was so plentiful. This is probably a slough somewhere, maybe in Richmond, or one of the areas where they're drying the salmon. Picture taken in 1880. There's a lady with a digging stick. She's been out digging clams, and she was in the early days selling clams in Vancouver. From that, the first Europeans came. This is a picture of our sign on the farm. It was 1877. Those are some of our scarlet runner beans that are growing in the garden around our farm sign. Whoops, gotta go back one. We had the first seed company, 1888, and Manoa Steves imported the first Holstein cattle to British Columbia around that time. My grandmother's side of the family, however, was the McElhenney family, and they didn't settle in Steveston, they settled here. And I've just been spending the day finding my own family history. And I just found out a couple of minutes ago, my grandmother, Bessie McElhenney, taught in the school in 1894. Apparently the school was built in 1893, so she was probably the first teacher. And this is my uncle, Alonzo McElhenney, and Irene Howard wrote a book, and she said Alonzo McElhenney was chopped the wood for the school. We think that this was taken here at Barnston, and that's the family record. It was the only picture we had when the family was here. And he's certainly chopping wood. You can see from that picture. Whether it's for the school or not, I don't know. But if anybody can identify similar buildings to that, that's got a log hut with a turf roof. And he's got his saw and his axe, and he's been doing a lot of chopping. And they farmed here. They had 160 acres they were farming. They applied for preemption, and then for some reason or other they gave it up, and they moved to Steveston. And Bessie McElhenney married my grandfather in 1898, 3 or 4 years after they were here. So that's a little bit of history. This is what Richmond looked like at that time. This is the area just south of the airport on Lulu Island. And our farm would be straight down that row way off in the distance someplace. There wasn't a house anywhere. Now that's after they diked it in 1900. It says, but it's probably after the dike was built, about 1907. Blueberries. This is on the right-hand corner is Bessie McElhenney, Bessie Steves, my grandmother that taught here. And when her children are big, and they're in the blueberry bogs harvesting blueberries and cranberries. They delivered milk in Vancouver. That's another one of the McElhenney boys. Every school had a garden, and this is where we're back to today. Boys and girls all worked planting the gardens, and this is a 19th school class in Richmond, and they're all lined up there admiring their garden for the picture to be taken. And we're getting back to that again. In 1944, we planted Victory Gardens, and I'm the second smallest one in there. My dad and my grandfather, and my uncle's horse. and we planted a victory garden. And the story behind that is we're getting to those times again with climate change. We're going to need a little more attention to agriculture, and a few more people are going to have to start planting gardens. During World War II, 42% of the food across North America was produced in gardens, not in farms, victory gardens. My uncle took that horse and plowed the streets. There's a couple of people from Steveston here, or formerly from Steveston, and he went up and down the road allowances and plowed the road allowances, and people went out along the roadsides and planted their gardens in World War II. Well, I said 60 years ago, in 1957, this is one of my favorite quotes, Dr. Sverre Pedersen, the world's top climatologist, he actually was a scientist that advised the Allies in World War II when to invade Germany when there was a big storm going, and they knew that troops would be under cover to get away from the rain. And anyway, he said in the next 50 years, if the current warm spell continues, there will be some remarkable changes in the weather. If this continues, there will be very little ice in the Arctic. That was 1957. By 2007, what was happening? The ice was breaking up. Ships were going through the Arctic. So, I was a student in agriculture in my graduating year. My first graduating year, I went through a couple other courses as well, was in 1960. And the year 1959-60, I was a teaching assistant to a graduate course called Agriculture 418. And that was assigned to us by my professor, and I had to teach half the course because he got very ill and dropped out at the end of the year, and I taught half a year's course. And what we were asking, back in 1959, exactly 60 years ago, how would changing weather affect farmland? How would world population increase and a change in the weather affect BC food sufficiency? 60 years ago. And we're still asking the same question. One of my profs, Dr. Rolls, said farms that don't adapt to the new chemical agriculture would survive. And they went out and put chemicals in all the farm fields. And after 60 years of chemical agriculture, it's helping to bring about climate change. Not only that, the United Nations tells us that 68% of the world's farm fields are deficient because they have not put the organics back. They've been using those chemical fertilizers for 60 years, and 68% of the world's farmland is deficient. They predict that we've only got 60 years left of good agriculture if we don't do something about it, because it's still going downhill. Agriculture changed from sequestering carbon dioxide 60 years ago to being the #2 cause of climate change. They called it the Green Revolution, if you remember that. And effectively it was on a collision course with climate change because it wasn't green at all. This is what Richmond looked in 1959, 60 years ago. All farmland except for one industrial site. And that was a rice mill. They were importing rice from Asia. This is Surrey, Barnston Island. All farmland. Well, I was going to UBC, and we'd have to go across this little bridge to get to Vancouver every morning. It was called the Marpole Bridge. And the bridge had to open and close for the boats to go through, and you'd have 20 or 30 cars lined up. And we complained, we said we needed a new bridge. Well, you gotta watch what you ask for. We got a new bridge. In 1957, the Oak Street Bridge opened. And in 1959, the farmers had never been told this. The city council had rezoned half of Richmond one night, around 1956 or 57 when they were building the bridge. And their taxes all went up in 1959, and farmers found that 12,000 acres and 1,000 farms had been rezoned. And our family farm was one of them. This is what Richmond looked like in 1959. Our farm is right there. And this is what it looked like by about 1969.
I still see it.
Yeah.
We're still there. And we have a farm outside the dike. Still there. We're the only ones left. In 1969, they had the port put out a study, and they were going to industrialize the Fraser. All of this was supposed to be a huge industrial development on the west dike of Richmond. The port expansion down there at Delta went ahead up here. And this was all supposed to be developed. The only farmland that was going to be left was a little strip there. You can see it's a little light colored, but all the farmland along the river was supposed to go as well. So in Richmond, we got a bit upset by it, and we actually formed Canada's first environmental group. It was called the Richmond Anti-Pollution Association. I was vice chair. And our objective was to stop the loss of farmland, to stop the port in particular, and also to stop the city from dumping raw sewage in the river, which they were just building these subdivisions, and that was going to destroy the fishery. We eventually got a secondary sewage treatment plant built, but we didn't stop the port. Anyway, 1973 came along. We knew about climate change. We knew the population was growing. We knew about the port plans to industrialize the Fraser. I did the research for the ALR, and I'm not sure where I got this information from, but it's from my own notes I presented to them. That 28% of our farms were gone. We were losing 10,000 acres a year. We were growing 86% of our fruit and vegetables. And look back at World War II, when we had victory gardens, we were growing 100%. We were worried we declined 86%. Well, 46 years later, we're down to 40%. We've lost 1% per year. And KPU, the Kwantlen University, is predicting that our production will be dropping down to 28%. Now, we cannot have food security, with only 28% production of our own food. And that's with the LR, because we've had losses since. We didn't lose massive amounts of farmland, but we've had lots of other losses since.
Do you mind just clarifying when you say we are growing, is that Canada or BC?
BC.
Okay.
Okay, now we separate BC from the rest of Canada because our soils are different and our crops are different. As I say to people, I've got a great quote on that one: we can't live on bread alone. I think you've heard that before. And that's what they produce west of the Rockies. And basically, our land is good for producing vegetables. Only a small part of it, 1.1% of BC can produce vegetables. And that's what produces the 40%, used to produce 86%. So the ALR provided farmland protection. We brought in an insurance program for the farmers because a lot of farmers were going broke. The blueberry crop had gone bankrupt, and we bailed them out with the insurance program, and now blueberries are flourishing as one of the most productive crops. We had, as part of it, an industrial land reserve, so that we were going to save industrial land as well, because we knew if they went and built housing on the industrial land, then the industrial people would come looking for farmland. And so we had an industrial land reserve. We also had some protection for estuaries as well. We set up a land bank, and we bought land and released it or sold it back to young farmers. And the first 4 years, we provided 10,000 acres to young farmers in 4 years, and then they shut that one down. We also set up BC's first allotment gardens, and that was on the Fantasy Garden site, for those of you who know Richmond and Bill Van Der Zam, near the tunnel. Then in 1976, I made a presentation to the Habitat for Humanity in Vancouver, and it was adopted by that branch of the United Nations worldwide that they wanted us to save our farmland. Well, in 1978, we started downhill, and it's been downhill ever since. The industrial land reserve was removed. They said that you can appeal your decisions if the Land Commission turns something down, you can appeal your decisions directly to the provincial cabinet, and they sold the allotment gardens to Fantasy Gardens. And what happened? A major development called Terra Nova, 300 or 400 acres, was removed from the ALR. The Land Commission turned it down. The cabinet overruled the Land Commission. The same thing happened in Delta. The Spetafor farm, it was called. The Land Commission turned it down. It was overruled by the cabinet. And we had battles over those. We had the 2 longest public hearings in Canadian history on those 2 developments. Saving farmland shifted to local government, and all the battles were at the local rezoning public hearings. Going further downhill, we got to 2014, and the government brought in Bill 24, and they were really trying to gut the LR. They set it up 2 zones. One zone, which was the coastal zone, continued the agricultural land reserve, but allowed wineries, meaderies, potbunkeries, distillers, and all kinds of non-farm uses that previously were in industrial land. We have a winery in Richmond that as soon as they did this, they sold their industrial property and bought a farm. And we don't know where they get their material for making their wine, but when they were in the industrial park, they were importing concentrated juice from Chile. So they simply sold their industrial site and became farmers. And that's the kind of stuff that's been happening. The panels that were province-wide panels, they made them into local panels, and the local panels were people that lived in the area, and of course you could lobby them to get your land out of the agricultural land reserve. And they made a rule. The commission must consider the economic, cultural, and social values, the regional and community planning objectives, and other prescribed considerations. In particular, if you're in Zone 2, which was the interior of BC, that was to allow fracking for oil and gas, and also for the Site C dam of the Peace River. And as I said at the bottom of here, the ALR became a general land reserve, included industrial now because that reserve was gone, and it's no longer an ALR until the recent changes in the legislation. The recent changes in the legislation are now being challenged by those who've had a free rein since 2014. So you're hearing a lot about how unfair what the government is doing really is. Well, the government even hasn't gone back as far as it was at 2014. They've only made a few modest changes to get back the ALR to what it was. And as I said, the threats are back, the Site C dam. We've got a situation where we're now producing power for future generations instead of producing food for future generations. Fracking of farmland, tube pipelines, trains, barges. The Port of Vancouver expanded Roberts Banks by 150 acres, 240 acres for a road, bought 220 acres in Richmond. We're fighting them on that to prevent it from happening. And on Friday, they got another 150 acres, 155 acres near Burns Bog in Delta. And the port is asking for 2,600 acres in total. And yet IOCO, which used to be an oil company in Vancouver, has 1,000 acres of industrial land. They're trying to get it rezoned for residential. This is what goes on. And this is the Richmond land. You see all those little dotted lines are properties the port's trying to take out of agriculture right now. We set up a committee on Metro Vancouver, which I chaired around 2006 to 2012, and we asked the province to come up with some rules and guidelines. And they did a report on it called BC Food Self-Reliance. It was a very good scientific analysis. And they said that BC must increase the amount of farmland under cultivation by 227,000 acres, or 92,000 hectares, of class 1 to 3 irrigated farmland, and 1 million acres of class 5 and 6 unirrigated lands if we're to be food secure. That's how to get back to our 100% again.
Is that anywhere near possible?
Pardon?
Is that anywhere near possible?
It's definitely possible. I'll explain that later. And we had a number of ideas. We need a hard line around the ALR. We need the end of the use of farmland for country estates and mega mansions. The province has finally dealt with that one. We need higher taxes on unfarmed holding lands to make it available for young people to farm it, because people are paying agricultural taxes and the land sits vacant. We want to return to land banking again, to lease land to young people for what we call incubator farms. Return golf courses, and when the original ALR was set up, we permitted golf courses because we knew that we didn't need all that farmland right away, but we would need it in the future. So we said, you can have a golf course, but when the time has come, that golf course should go back into agriculture. Well, guess what, folks? The golf courses that are shutting down now because not many people play golf that much anymore. They're trying to get rezoned for a higher and better use. And we need to change from recreational agriculture to food production, and that's where you get the extra land to make up the the 92,000 hectares. A lot of our farmland now is in horse farms and other activities that aren't producing food. I gave this speech at Langley a year or two ago, and they said, well, I don't want to give my horses. I said, look, when people get hungry enough, we'll just probably want to eat your horse. That's the problem. And we need to free up rangeland in the BC interior. We need to improve interior soils. And in going around here, you've got tremendous potential for the same thing to improve the soils. One of the things I've been trying to work on with Metro Vancouver is what you do with human waste, which is biosolids. I'll talk about that a little later. And ways of getting compost materials to rebuild the soils. Class 7 soils, if you put enough compost and manures and organics on it, can become class 5 or even 4, maybe even 3 soils over a period of time. You can really build up the soils. And instead of sending our garbage to the dump or burning it or whatever we do with it, we need to think of sorting out our waste so we can rebuild our soils. We need a public purchasing policy to buy local in schools, hospitals, and government institutions. And here's the one I have for government, that if they want to build a highway and take 200 acres out, they got to put 400 acres back, because the government seems to think that they can do whatever they want, and that includes the port. And the one thing that I advise right now that you should be doing here is ban cosmetic pesticides. Compost the yard waste for soil rehabilitation. I'll comment on that later. We did it in Richmond, and it's been immensely successful part of the way. Well, here's the problem. In 2015, they had an extreme drought in California. 93% of the reservoirs were empty, and California produces 84% of our broccoli and cauliflower, 76% of our strawberries. We used to be a strawberry exporting province. 68% of our lettuce, 69% of our carrots, turnips, and other root crops, 89% of almonds, and mostly and oranges, and probably as much of our grapes as well. Even though we grow grapes in the Okanagan, our grapes are going for wine, which is okay. And this is what they're predicting California might look like by 2050. Not a pretty picture. That's where we get our food. So, what's the answer? We need a new generation of food producers. Metro Vancouver has put in an urban containment boundary that we're trying to maintain. We keep stepping over it from time to time. I say it's a hard line around the ELR and hard line around the industrial land, sort of. And in 2015, Metro Vancouver adopted a food system strategy suggesting buy local at farmers markets, local processing, agricultural land trust, and so on. But we haven't done it yet. But it's policy. Richmond did do these things, and I'm going to comment on these later on. We banned cosmetic pesticides and GMOs. We collected organic compost. We moved an amendment to our parks bylaw that agriculture is allowed in all parks. Now think of that one for a moment. We're fortunate it's something you don't have in Bowen Island. We have highly densified areas with high rises. And development cost charges we collect in the high rises, we're allowed to collect money for parks. So we're buying parkland and then we're farming it because agriculture is permitted in parks. In 2006, we went to the Habitat for Humanity again, and myself and a couple others were approached by a group from the United Nations that said, you preserved your farmland in 1976, you've got land in your city center, we would like you to set up a farm school. We need to feed the people, and you're not going to feed the people from the farms out of town. Basically, the farms all around the world are they're exporting back and forth to everybody else, and they're missing the cities and the hubs and the people that need the food the most. We would like you to set up a farm operation that would teach people how to farm in the city so you can feed the city when it's needed. I was at the meeting. Skip Triplett, the president of Quantum, was there, and the United Nations group, my mayor was there. We had a handshake all around, And Kent Mullinex, some of you have met and heard of before, was hired to do the job. And Richmond acquired the land to do it, which I'll show you later. So we set up the farm school. We've got joint school park programs. We grow and buy from farmers, provide nutritious lunches. This is all the aims. One of our parks, we have a holding pond to collect roof water so that we've got water for the farms. And we have set up what I call municipally supported agriculture. MSA, it used to be medical services, something. MSA for the community. With school and municipal allotment gardens, incubator farms, rooftop gardens, solar roofs, and so on. The incubator farm is what happens after you've graduated from the farm school. You need a piece of land to go farming. The city is providing that farm to these young farmers, incubator farms. And we have set up those programs at 3 parks in Richmond, the Terra Nova Rural Park, the Garden City Lands, and what used to be Fantasy Gardens. And that's what I'll tell you a little bit more of the Quantland Farm School. This is the Terra Nova Rural Park, and I'll leave this behind because all the information is on these maps. It'll give you ideas of what you might do. I'm looking at this regional park you've got here. It's ideal. What a gem you've got here that you can do so much with. This is what we've done here. The city actually spent $26 million. It was rezoned, and we had to buy it at a high price because the council changed the voters threw the whole council out except one person. And the new council came in, and we had a referendum and got 72% to buy the land for $26 million. There's 100 garden plots for allotment gardens. We have a schoolyard society. Actually, that's an old number, probably about 2,000 children have gone through it by now. A sharing farm which grows food for the food bank. They've got greenhouses and part of the lands for the food bank. And a healing garden which grows various types of medicinal plants. I mentioned it was the idea of habitat at the UN. And there are some incubator farms here, although in the future there won't be. We'll have them elsewhere. This is the gate to the allotment gardens at Terra Nova. This is the little barn we have there. And this was the school gardens under construction. We raised beds, and you can see we've got mixing soil to go in the beds. And we've got a farm to school program. These are raised beds at one of the schools. Some of the schools are involved, some aren't. We were talking this morning, apparently there's been some chefs and doing some projects here. One of the persons that started all this at Terra Nova was a chef, and he got the kids gardening. He is now the head of the whole program. The other thing we're doing at the Terra Nova Rural Park, originally there was a slough with the First Nations village up. You see Musqueam Village site way at the top, probably similar to the one I showed you in the beginning picture. And in March 12th, this was back in 2015 when I did this picture up, the water was too low and too warm, and the sockeye salmon were being threatened. Now we've heard this year that there's hardly any salmon coming back. Well, let's see now, 2015, 16, 17, 18, the salmon runs every 4 years. So the result, no salmon this year, because the salmon runs were low in 2015. And we said we've got to put this slough in and let salmon spawn, because chum salmon, which is a different species, spawn at the river's mouth. And so we've dug the slough. I haven't been able to convince the engineers to cut a hole in the dike yet. We're working on it. They say we'll flood Richmond. Well, there's got to be a way to let the salmon in. This is what the slough looks like at Terra Nova Rural Park. So we've got both agriculture and fish. This is Van der Zam's Fantasy Gardens. And the ponds there, the stores in that are outside of the picture. Originally, the property was agriculture in the agricultural land reserve, and when the NDP government got elected, ICBC, and well, actually BC hadn't been looked at. It was the branch of the motor vehicle branch that was doing car inspections. They were looking at the property for a depot for getting their car inspected. And lo and behold, I got elected as MLA, and the minister involved, Minister of Highways, get up and announce they're going to have an ICBC and a car inspection depot on this land. I got up and said, the hell you are. Except I was a little more polite than that. I said, that's farmland. Anyway, I got a reprimand the next day in the college. You can't get up and attack a cabinet minister like that. And I said, well, the cabinet minister shouldn't attack my land like that. This is Dave Barrett. Dave Barrett looked at him and he said, he's right. Turned the land over to Dave Stupich, who was Minister of Agriculture, and we set it up as Allotment Gardens, the first in BC. Incoming government, they sold the Allotment Gardens to Bill Van der Zam, but they kept part of it, and the part of it they kept where the ponds are, Bill Van der Zam made as a religious garden with Bibles and religious figures around the park as a park. And we have now redeveloped that part of it. What used to be Fantasy Gardens now is apartments, and as the deal to allow the apartment density, we got $2.5 million in development cost charges, which we then used to buy the land to put in the park. And most of that, all along the top and along the inside there, is going to be allotment gardens and incubator farms. We're keeping the ponds in. I don't think you're going to find too many Bibles in it, but anyway, it'll be a non-religious park. And then this is the gem. Right in the center of Richmond, it's called the Garden City Lands. Another change in council to get this one. The federal government owned it, and it's part of what used to be the Lulu Island Bog. And we got one end of the bog. In the 60s, we made a land swap and acquired a couple of hundred acres for the Richmond Nature Park. Then there's a big chunk of land, a quarter section, that belongs to the Department of National Defense. And then there's this part, which also belonged to National Defense. And the Defense came up with a wonderful idea that they would simply go and build high-rise apartments on it. We said, hell you will. It's in the Agricultural Land Reserve. And that was when I showed the picture of my family picking blueberries and cranberries, that's where they were picking them. And so we had a big battle. Initially the vote was 8-1 in favor of redevelopment, and then it was then became 7-2, and then there was 3 of us. And then finally in the middle of an election campaign, one of the groups had 3 candidates running that had been supporting the housing development, came over to me and said, you know, the public really doesn't want that housing development. We're on your side. So suddenly we had 6 votes. And right after the election, we canceled the rezoning and we bought the property. Cost us $60 million. But we paid for it under our parks development charges. And the interesting thing was, we were slated to buy 12 acres of land just across the street for $60 million. It didn't make much sense to buy 12 acres and for $60 million we could have bought this and keep the whole thing. And so we didn't buy the 12 acres, we bought the Garden City lands instead. And the area that's in the light color we're maintaining as bog. That was a sphagnum bog originally, and it's still a sphagnum bog. The sphagnum is not too healthy because there's not enough water, but we're hoping to revitalize it. We had to keep it mowed over the years because when bogs get dry out, the weed trees come up and destroy the bogs. So we've been keeping it mowed until we solve the problem of how we keep the water in. The areas that are in the darker green are areas that we're farming. And Kwantlen has already planted crops on 20 acres. And there'll be more land available for crops as well in the future as we work across the property. We actually built a dike right across the middle of it, diagonally, across that way. So this side will be bog and this side will be farmed. It's a park. But the joy of it is, it's a park that's being farmed and will be farmed. And this is the park that the United Nations was interested in. So we have the farm school operating. The young farmers are coming out now looking for land. The Fantasy Gardens one would be ready for another year, but they'll be able to get their incubator farms over at the Fantasy Gardens site. We have some lands south of Steveston Highway along the river, about 50 acres, where we're providing incubator farms now. And so we'll be able to teach a new generation of young farmers, and they'll be coming looking for farmland. They'll be coming here looking for places to farm. They'll be coming around BC looking for places to farm. The interest is there. There's young people that want to get back to the land. They know we've got a problem. They know that agriculture can help solve the climate change problem, and they're committed to doing it. And we want to help them. We're looking at part of it being a bit of a community hub. We had a farmers festival there this summer on farmers market. Probably we'll get the farmers market quite common in the future. We're looking at, once again, teaching how to rotate your crops. What's happened, the reason that 68% of the world's soils are depleted is because once they invented Roundup and chemical fertilizers, you just kill everything off, plant one crop, put your fertilizers in, and you grow that crop year in and year out, and it's monoculture. You're not returning anything to the soil. With a crop rotation, particularly with livestock, you would have a hay field, and you'd mow hay for a couple of years. Then you would graze it for a couple of years. Then you'd plow it under, and you've got all the manures from the cattle and all the manures and from the grass that's plowed under, and you would grow potatoes, you'd grow various other crops, and then you go through the rotation again. And you would build the soil, you would capture the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you would get it into the soil. Scientists have found that what we call regenerative agriculture actually traps carbon dioxide and will actually get it down a meter or two into the ground. In the past, they've just been testing the surface, but the roots and everything else and water going down takes your carbon further into the ground. And so when you destroy land like that, you're releasing, particularly when you flood it like Site C, you're actually releasing carbon that's been stored for 10,000 years. We're looking at putting the carbon back into the ground. A sphagnum bog is the most important carbon sink on the planet. And what we're looking at is collecting rooftop water from the tall buildings, and hopefully being able to get enough water in to raise the water table up that we don't have to mow it any longer, and we can revitalize the sphagnum bog. And of course, we're doing a lot of composting, and everything's organic and no GMOs. And this was the first crop Quantum took off the farm school in 2018. These are some notes that you can look at later. Anybody copies it down. I've pretty well covered it. The Garden City lands is 136 acres. And it's our peat bog park. The Fantasy Gardens, the Fantasy Gardens, we renamed it. We took the fantasy out of it. It's no longer a fantasy, it's the gardens. And there's along number 5 road in Richmond, the highway that goes from the tunnel to the Oak Street Bridge. There's a huge row of farmland that is preserved in agriculture, because years ago what Richmond did, there was a lot of temples building, and we said we'll allow you to build temples facing number 5 road if you farm 2/3 of the property. And 2/3 of the property is available for farming. We found out the religious people aren't very good at farming. And we're hoping that with the Fantasy Gardens site, we'll be able to convince them to either give the land, lease the land, or whatever to the city, so we'll extend the incubator farms up behind all the churches and temples. And it will give us an amazing large amount of land to expand the incubator farms. Within the school system, we've got a group called Farm to Cafeteria, and they're working on various park and school programs. It's a separate program from ours, but we're trying to integrate them together. In some cases, school rooftop gardens. In some cases, they've talked about buying land for food from farmers to have a decent lunch at school. We have, I don't have it on here, we have made a requirement in Richmond that some building tops should be for agriculture. We've been successful in getting 2. We gave them a choice, put solar panels on the roof or something to combat climate change, or to put a farm on the roof. Unfortunately, we got tremendous objections from the insurance companies. You can't have people up on the roof. And so we've had difficulty getting farming on the roof, but we did get one in my neighborhood in Steveston at Number 1 Road and Chatham Street, which they put raised boxes on the roof so that the insurance people can look under and see the roof's okay. But we lost out on a major one. We tried to convince IKEA, a 5-acre roof. You could have put 5 acres of greenhouses, and they refused to do it. They built the roof strong enough because we're concerned about water. They put a wall around the roof, and they can hold that much water on the roof, but they wouldn't put a farm on the roof. We're trying to change those bylaws to somewhere along the line to make it either mandatory to have solar or mandatory to have rooftop farming. That's yet to come. Metro Vancouver, and this is where you come in because you've got a park here that belongs to Metro Vancouver, and this is what we planned for Colony Farm. It hasn't gotten very far because we're having a great argument about Colony Farm. And what the intent was that 1/3 of the farm should be for wildlife and nature. 1/3 of the farm would be somewhat conventional farming, and 1/3 of the farm would show what you can do to combine nature and conventional farming together. In other words, totally regenerative agriculture, hedgerows around the farm so the birds and the animals are there, planting crops, pollinator crops and things like that, so that you can show that agriculture and parks go very, very well together. Unfortunately, I'm having some difficulty getting to reapprove this. The plan's all done, but that was 7 or 8 years ago now, and we're not getting very far. I've been talking to UBC, and I was involved in saving the UBC farm, and they're ready for another project. So I'm thinking UBC might get involved to try and get this one going. The big complaint that the Metro Vancouver has is that there's the Coquitlam First Nation is next door, and they've got a land claim on the area. Well, they've got a land claim on everything, and I can't see why they would object us to farming the land. We don't have to build any buildings on it, and UBC thinks because they've been working very closely with First Nations that they may be able to work something out. So here's hoping. Basically, it once was a federal experimental farm, and that's why it was called Colony Farm, not a very good name for First Nations. So maybe that's the problem. We rename it, we'll be great. And Metro Vancouver owns it, and a requirement when Metro Van took it over from the federal government was that it should be farmed. 647 acres, and I mentioned it would be a mixture. We were looking at a main farm of 40 acres with berries, livestock, and a market garden, and 77 acres of 2 to 10 acre micro farms to show it's possible to make a living on a small, well-managed farm. We need somewhere to show it can be done. You're looking at the same thing here in your report. And I was so excited today to see the potential you have here to do on Bowen Island what we're talking about doing at Colony Farm. Well, this is my pet peeve. One of the things you can do the best on Bowen Island is to do what we did in Richmond. In 2009, we banned Roundup and all cosmetic pesticides. It was an incredible time. Monsanto, they flew people in from Alberta to come to our council meeting to tell us the errors of our ways. And my mayor, who was somewhat sitting on the fence, was being lectured by these people, and he's a lawyer, and he got so angry he became a most ardent supporter. And it went through unanimously. And we had one problem, and that was we had 4 dairy farms that were growing GMO corn. And we didn't want to make it retroactive because that's pretty hard to do. So we exempted those 4 farms. Legally, we're not allowed to tell farms they can't use Roundup anyway, but we did. But if anybody wanted challenges on it, we probably would lose in the LR. We would not lose on the residential section of town. And so it's worked. And so all the tree clippings, all the yard waste that's picked up is cosmetic pesticide free. It also applies to the farmer's front yard, his residential part. So they might be able to spray their blueberries, but they can't spray their lawn, which is interesting. Then we had the company that was looking after the composting. It was a farm company from Pitt Meadows that the person that was running it, a young farmer, was an agrologist, and they were first windrowing the compost and working with the compost. And we suggested, why don't you put in an anaerobic digester and capture the methane, and we'll use that for a fuel and get electricity, because compost lets off carbon dioxide when it's decaying anyway, so might as well decay it fast and collect it rather than letting it go off into the atmosphere. And so these are the anaerobic digesters that they set up. The compost was pure. We had it analyzed, and the analysis came out that it was so clean of cosmetic pesticides or any other poisons that it could be used on our organic gardens everywhere. And that's what the compost pile looked like. It was amazing. Unfortunately, my colleagues in Metro Vancouver decided that they wanted to ship their yard waste in. And that worked for a while too. The company, actually they sold, unfortunately, the Pitt Meadows company sold it to an American company called Harvest Power. But before they did, the Pitt Meadows company kept our yard waste separate from the yard waste from Burnaby, which was full of plastic, and various other communities that didn't bother to keep it clean. And they were packaging our yard waste separately and selling it as basically good for organic gardens. But then Metro decided that they wanted to collect food waste. And food waste, a lot of it rots. Leaves and grass ferments, and you don't get odors. And they collected the food waste, mixed it in with our yard good stuff in their anaerobic digesters. It smelled to the high heavens, stunk out all of South Vancouver and Richmond, and we had so many complaints that we had to shut the anaerobic digesters down. If Metro Vancouver would have taken a second thought and said, we're not going to put the food waste mixed in with the yard waste, it probably would have survived, but I couldn't convince anybody to do that. They were already collecting the food waste, they had to get rid of it. Most of it now is going to Delta, and Delta's got the odor problems there, and everybody's complaining about the odors there. The other aspect of it is meats and stuff like that we're getting in, and meat really rots. And I argued again, unsuccessfully, that we should be collecting our meat separately, and it should go to West Coast Reduction in Vancouver. But West Coast Reduction is under attack by Vancouver. We'd like them to move away. So we got that kind of byplay. So the end result is a wonderful idea that worked is now in limbo. But you can do it in a small scale. In my yard, I've got a green cone. Now we got a farm, so all of our yard waste, our grass is fed to our cows, so lawn clippings, and even the leaves and that go in with the manures. But a green cone from the United Kingdom has a screen at the bottom, and believe it or not, you can actually put bones in it, and over a period of time, the meat will decay, and there's very little odor. And the bottom of the screen keeps the rats out. So it's something you do in your own gardens to keep mixing in some of these foods that have odors from putting it in with the clean yard waste that you want to compost.
Does it smell?
Pardon?
Smell bad? Does it smell?
No, it's such a small scale.
Right.
So if everybody had one in the yard, you'd never notice it. You put a big one in and it's going to stink up the city.
It's aerobic, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what we're doing. On our farm, we're a heritage farm, as mentioned earlier. I just want to toss this in a little bit. We've been working since actually 1982. We joined the Seed Savers Exchange in the United States. And in around 1987 or 89, Buckerville shut down, which produced local seeds. And they had actually taken the seed stock that our family had been producing 100 years earlier. And so we got most of the seed varieties back from Buckerfields, and we're now raising about 60 or 70 varieties of vegetables that were climatized to this area 100 years ago. And I mentioned earlier, 1.1% of sea soil is class 1 to 4, capable of growing vegetables, and that's what we're looking at. It's not very much land. And we've got alpha tomatoes that my great-grandfather tested in Richmond in 1888, and they come in 2 weeks earlier than any other variety. We've been growing them with friends all over BC, and we get the same report wherever they're grown. We also have early large red tomatoes, which we don't have in bulk yet. Believe it or not, in the 40s and 50s, Kamloops was a major tomato growing area, probably all of Canada. I remember when I got elected in 1968, going to a municipal convention in Kamloops, and they served a beefsteak, tomato, a slice that big, before they served the real beefsteak, because it was a major tomato growing area. The I-5 and cheap labor in Mexico ended the tomato growing in British Columbia, but we're still growing the same varieties that they were growing in Kamloops in the 50s. Monsanto came up with a purple tomato and said, we're going to change the world. We got a purple tomato that's full of antioxidants that will save people's health. Well, we've got a heritage purple tomato. It's called Macado. 4% of BC is class 5 to 7 soils. And I mentioned earlier we need to build up the soils with compost. In Metro, we're debating building up soils with biosolids. We passed a motion on Friday to dry the biosolids is the sewage, solid sewage that when it goes through this, that doesn't go through the sewage plant, that's saved, and only the liquid goes out in the end. And we passed a motion on Friday to dry it out and pellet it, and it could be burned in a cement kiln, or it could be put on farmland or in forested land to grow things. The problem with biosolids is that we take so many horrible medicines that we're polluted, and if our waste materials go onto farmland, then we've got a problem. So a couple of years ago I met with some of this Metro staff, and hopefully they're following through with this, to analyze what happens when our biosolids become soil, and are these materials absorbed by the plants? Because that 68% of the planet's soil that is depleted needs organics, and we are the biggest producer of organic materials on the planet, and yet we're polluting our oceans with it, and we're not using it in the right way. Grassland is mostly that 5 to 7%. Your soils here are in that 5 to 7 class of land. The lands here probably would be in the 5 to 7 class. You can build them up to class 3 with manures and compost. And I was really excited to see the plant you've got set up down at your allotment gardens there, where you're working at doing that, because that could build all these soils. They'll be just as good as any of the soils in Richmond, better than the ones that have been depleted.